Alright, so in this video we're going to finish off our character's animation. Our character has currently breathed in, done a few jumps up to the ladder, he's now climbed up the ladder. So all that's left to do is get our character to jump to the end of the board, do a few jumps, getting higher and higher in Y each time, and on the final jump he's going to do a backflip and spin down into our pool. Now we're not going to worry about animating the diving board in this video, we'll do that in the next video, so we just have to keep in mind that the diving board will be animated, but we're going to base the diving board's animation off of our character animation anyway, so let's go and get the character animated in this video. So I'm going to select our character, and I'm going to scroll so that we can deal with the next section of our animation. So we've got our character landing and preparing for the next jump. So I want our character to do a jump to the end of the diving board, much like the very first jumps that we did. So where we've got our keyframe in Y, I also want to set a keyframe in X. And let's say 30 frames after this, so let's move to around 480 or so, we're going to move to the end of the board and set our position in Y so that we're on the end of the board. So between those 2 points, it's currently going to look like we're just floating. So around the midpoint, let's grab our translate Y and pull up on translate Y. So much as in the first jump, we do need to make sure that we edit our tangents for this curve so that we get the correct look to the curve. So I'm going to shift middle click on translate Y, push H to home up. I'm going to select this tangent handle going into the curve, the tangent handle coming out of the curve, and select untie. I'm then going to modify the tangents of this curve to give us a curve that looked very similar to when we were dealing with our initial jumps. So now if we were to watch this last jump back, our Y is kind of high, but the tangents at least are working fairly nicely. So let's shift middle click to bring up Y, H, to home up. So I'm going to grab this keyframe, center it up slightly, and also click on its value and bring it down slightly, modifying our handles as necessary to kind of smooth this out. I was feeling that he was jumping up too high in Y, and also basically jumping up too slowly and then coming to a rest too abruptly because the middle keyframe was biased too much towards the end of the animation as opposed to the beginning. That's a bit better. We'll put some squash and stretch in and then see. Maybe it needs to be 2 jumps rather than 1 jump. Yeah. That might make more sense. But we'll put the squash and stretch in and see. So as we perform the jump, actually, yeah, it's going to need to be 2 jumps because he's moving way too quickly.
Because he's taking a pretty big leap there.
Yeah, but that's not the problem. It's really easy to do. So let's shift middle click on our Y, H to home up. And we can simply say, okay, this is our first jump, but we now really want it to basically take less duration, and then we can go on to translate X and set our translate X to be the center of the board for this jump. So let's make this jump take maybe 20 frames instead of 30. So I'm going to grab this keyframe and slide it back a few frames. Grab the middle keyframe, slide him back some. Maybe just take a little off the value as well. And on frame, if we move to our next keyframe, on this frame 471, I want our translate X to be around the center of the diving board. Now on the next keyframe for translate X, let's shift middle click and home up on X. I basically don't want this keyframe here because that's only a few frames after we've just set this key. So I'm going to select this key and push delete to remove that translate X keyframe. So now our jump should hopefully look a little bit more sensible. Yeah, that's better. So we've got our Y working quite nicely, so let's deal with the second jump, then we can come back in and do our squash and stretch and our bending. So the second jump, it will take us to the end of the diving board. It'll take around again 20 frames, so around to 490. Let's move in X, and also Alt left click to key in Y, and then move round to about the center point, and give a subtle bounce on Y. Very floaty. So let's shift middle click on Y, H to home up, and deal with sorting out our tangent. So this tangent is already untied, so we can move him up. Let's tweak that value slightly. Let's select the tangent leaving that curve and untie that so that we also have control over the end section of the curve. So now our character should jump onto the board and then do a final jump to the end of the board. Maybe translate X is decelerating a little bit too much. It's kind of like slowing down just a tad. So I'm going to shift middle click on translate X, H2 home up. And here where we've got the end section of our translate X, I'm going to change the tangent so that instead of decelerating, so where we're changing over time, we were holding a very similar X value on the end. I want that to be still changing in X as we come to the end. So I'm going to bring off the weight on this final tangent. So instead of holding this X value for a few frames, we're only going to hold it just for a couple of frames, which means we're going to have less of that noticeable deceleration as our ball moves to the end. Now, as for squash and stretch, I'm going to get the ball to stretch up into the jump, return to 0 a frame before impact, squash on impact, just as with our initial jumps. So let's stretch up into the jump, return to 0 1 frame before impact, and then on impact we're going to squash down, stretch up into the jump, return to 0 a frame before impact, and then on impact squash down. Cool. So also, because we're moving in translate X, it'd be cool to have some bend animation in there. So let's get our character to bend forward into the jump. As we go through the peak of the jump, bend backwards, returning to 0 on impact. I do want to make sure that the bend isn't affecting the end of the animation of our ladder, and it's not. That's cool. So as we move into this jump, bend forwards. As we move over the peak, bend backwards slightly, and then 0 out on impact. Now for the jumps on the diving board, we're going to do a series of jumps with very similar translate Y that we've seen as we're moving on X, but X is going to remain constant because we're just going to jump up and down on the spot. So we're going to animate Y to jump up, come down slightly because the board's going to bend, up further because now the board is giving us some propulsion, it's throwing us up into the air. We'll come down slightly further again because now the board is bending under more force, up further, slightly down further. On the final jump, we're going to go up fairly high in Y, and then we're going to come down and land in the pool. Now with the squash and stretch on these jumps, we're going to animate that very similarly to our jumps that we had on the ladder, in as much as when we leave the diving board we're going to throw our weight upwards, and then on impact we're going to squash down just on the frame of impact because we're not really preparing for the jump because the diving board is now throwing us up and down. However, because we're not moving in X, we're not going to worry about having any bend animation because we're just jumping on the spot. So with these jumps, let's get the first jump and say that it takes, I don't know, I'm just going to throw out there something like 25 frames, so 490, so let's go to around 515, and that's going to be the end of our jump, and we're going to come down slightly lower than we have done already. Then for the next jump, I want that to take slightly more time because we're moving further. I am going to shift middle click on translate Y just so that we can see our translate Y values, because now translate Y is scoped. So that jump is going to take around 25 frames. Let's make this jump take a little bit longer, and we'll move down slightly further at the end of that jump. And this will be our final jump before the full flip. I want to take that a little bit longer and down slightly further. Now we can come back in and create the peaks of these jumps. So for this jump, we're going to jump up around about the same amount that we've been doing on any of the other jumps, because the diving board's not really helping us out here yet. For this jump, let's come up slightly further. And for this jump, let's come up slightly further again. So now we're going to have, it's going to be floaty at the moment, but we jump once. And again. I think I missed the first one. There we go. So we're going to jump again, and jump again. And then the final jump after this point is going to take us to the pool. So let's extend our animation slightly further still. This will take a little bit longer because we're now going to fall all the way down to the ground. So let's go to around 630. And we're going to move down. And if I switch over to a side view, So that was space and 3, W so that we are in wireframe. I'll move translate Y so that we're resting on the bottom of the pool. Now we do need to deal with our translate X animation for the end, but let's get our curves all set up for translate Y first and come back in and put in translate X in a second. So I'm going to push space 1 to switch back over to a perspective view, and W to bring back shading. It makes things a little bit clearer to see what's going on. So for that final jump, we do want to make sure that we add a peak to that jump. So let's bring our translate Y up fairly high for that one, since that's our final jump. Great, so I'm going to shift middle click on translate Y to bring up the channel editor, H to home up on our curve. And we can see where we've left off, because these curves have the nice sharp tangents giving us the desired look of the curve, and these curves are very floaty. So let's create these curves just as we've seen so many times before. So I'm going to untie these handles and add some more impact, give some more weight to the top of the curve, untie these handles, a little bit more weight on the top of the curve, untie these handles, and on our final jump we still need to maintain that deceleration under gravity and then acceleration under gravity, and when we finally hit in Y we're going to be travelling at our fastest speed, so we want to make sure, if we select this and untie the handles, that we still come down and to an abrupt stop as opposed to decelerating, because it wouldn't make sense for the character to decelerate before he's impacted with the pool. So something like that. Taking a look at the peaks of these curves, I do want to decrease our middle jumps slightly so that these are more evenly stepped between the heights of each of those jumps on the diving board. And in terms of the basically the bottoms of the curves, I'm very happy with the decreasing values there and the increasing values on the tops. So with that, that should be translate Y for those jumps in place. If we were to play that back, so we've got our first jump, our second jump, our third jump, and then our final jump. Maybe those jumps are a little bit too slow, so let's bring up our translate Y, shift middle click, H to home up, and I'm just going to simply take the keyframes and start making these jumps slightly smaller. So let's move that back just to speed things up a little bit. Something like that should work quite nicely. So he jumps to the end of the board, first jump, second jump, third jump, and that will be his final jump with the backflip down into the pool. So let's get our translate X animated so that he currently is jumping through our board and not actually jumping into the pool. So on that final jump, he's going to leave the board, and just after he leaves the board, we'll start the translate X. So let's key our translate X at this current position, and then somewhere after he's gone up the peak, but obviously before he comes back down to possibly colliding with the board, if we switch over to a top view with space 2, we can move our character out in X so that he's over the pool and will not collide with the diving board. So space 1 to come back to a perspective view. So now if we were to watch that back, we'll see him jump, jump, and he moves over as he jumps and falls into the pool. Fantastic. So let's deal with our squash and stretch, which for these jumps is going to be very similar to the squash and stretch that we've seen for all the other jumps that this character performs. So we squash on impact. As we go towards the peak of the jump, we're going to stretch out. One frame before impact, which currently is going to be, it looks like impact's there, but impact is actually here. So one frame before that, let's
he just happens to look as though he's sitting perfectly on it. Basically, because the board...
Yeah, I do want that to be the impact, because the board won't have animated by this point. When, on each of the jumps, he's going to push the board down,
right.
He's going to leave the board is then going to settle back out before he comes back down. So the board is always going to be zeroed out when he comes back down. So when he collides with the board, as opposed to being on his minimum of the jump, that's when we're going to key our squash and stretch at being squashed. One frame before that was zero out. So what's going to happen, even though he's jumped on the board, And like here, he'll be jumping on the board, pushing the board down. By the time he comes back down, we're going to have settled the board back out so that this would still be, let's undo that movement. This here would still be the impact frame, even though he moves for a few frames after that. So he's hit the board. He's then going to stretch out into the peak of the jump. It's going to come back down. That board's going to have settled. So that will be our first frame of impact with the board. The frame before will zero out. But what you'll notice that we've got a problem with from before is we impact with the board. And we're very hard to notice because we've only gone down a frame, but as squash and stretch is actually, even though we're still moving down on the board, has started to increase again because we've got a keyframe here, and we should really still be squashed because we're moving down and being pushed against the board, but it's starting to go back up. I'm not going to worry about it over on this one because it's so subtle, but on some of the other jumps it may become more apparent because we'll have more frames between hitting the board and being at our minimum. So we're stretched up, we come back down, impact. So yeah, here on the minimum of our translate Y, I'm going to key squash and stretch again at that squashed value. Up just before the peak, we're going to stretch out. Over the peak, we're going to come back down. And that will be our frame of impact, so that will be when we squash. So frame before that, I want to zero out. So that's where we squash. That will be the minimum of our jump, so I'm going to key squash and stretch again so we stay squashed when we're pushing the board down. For our final jump, I'm not going to wait until nearer the peak, I'm going to wait until just a few frames after the jump to stretch him out. And around this point, in a second, we're going to animate the rotate such that our ball will rotate and do a backflip down into the pool. And as we come down to the pool, let's switch over to a side view, space 3, and bring up our wireframe with W. We can see on this frame we're going to impact with the pool, so we want to squash right down. On the frame before that, we want to be zeroed out. So now if we can stay in a side view, I guess, to preview this back. So we jump, we do our final jump, we'll be spinning, and then we squash on impact. So let's key that spinning now. So let's wait until we leave the board for the final time, and just after we leave the board, around here, just a few frames after, I'm going to key our special rotate at 0. And he's going to be doing a backflip, doing a backflip, doing a backflip, right around the middle of his fall between the board and the pool. I want the backflip to end, and I want him to, in that backflip, kind of cover 3 full rotations. Well, 3 full rotations, depending on the direction we want to go, is going to be 1080 degrees. That's 3 times 360. And the direction we want to go, I want him to do a backflip, so I want to go in the negative direction. Probably easier to see that if I just zero that back out and go to our previous keyframe, because he's stretched out slightly here. I will stretch him out more because that's kind of not stretched out enough. We can see that if we go negatively, his head will start moving backwards, whereas if we go positively, he's doing a front flip. So let's zero that out. And on the next keyframe that we set, we actually lost that. So around here, special rotate. Let's go to negative 1080. So between our keyframe of the start of the backflip, so here, we're going to start doing a backflip. You can barely see because it's so small. And I am going to scope that because I think my keyframes have got shifted around. So let's shift middle click. Yeah, I got a keyframe. Let's home up on that keyframe here that I really don't need. So let's delete that out. That looks much healthier. Great. So now, there we do, doing a backflip, spinning, and then as we settle out into crashing down into the pool.
Nice.
Now I do want to slightly change the backflip, very slightly. Let's scope our special rotate, home up. I want to have slightly less time spent on the deceleration and slightly more time spent on the acceleration, just because when we first do the backflip, I really want it to feel like he's slowly accelerating, then spinning, and by the point that we're finishing the backflip's not so important anymore. It's more important that we're about to impact with the pool. So I don't want to spend too long with the deceleration. I kind of just want to decelerate fairly quickly so that then the audience's mind isn't on that deceleration, it's on the impact that's about to occur with the pool.
Right.
Hopefully that makes some kind of sense.
I think so.
Animation is a very artistic thing, so you can take this any direction you really want to. This is the direction I've decided to take it with the character. So now if we were to watch that back, he'll jump, spring, spring, spring. On the final one, he'll go into a backflip. He's spinning. And then he'll settle down, ready for the impact. And with that, that's everything for the character's animation. We do need to come back in and animate the diving board, and we've obviously got all of our cameras and audience to animate. But in terms of the lead character, that's everything wrapped up.
Sounds excellent. All right, well, with that will conclude this video. Thanks a lot.